Hey class, today we're looking at a chapter from Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception titled The Body as Expression and Speech. And in this chapter, Merleau-Ponty is giving us a phenomenological reading of speech. He's providing us with phenomenological descriptions of being engaged in speech, what he calls the speaking subject. But he's also doing something more. He's also giving us an entire theory of the origin and what is fundamental to language. He's giving us a theory of language. And his theory basically is that language is based in gesture. So gestural meaning is the original and most fundamental aspect of speech. And taking this as the central origin and feature of language radically shifts the focus that prior thinkers had given for theories of speech. Merleau-Ponty is constantly trying to resist reverting back to a third-person explanation. We've seen this in the theory of perception. Perception should not be considered as a linear relation of things existing outside of each other, subject and object, or stimuli and representation. Instead, we need to see it in a more gestalt, holistic sense, as a kind of circuit and something organic. Well, the exact same thing is going on here with speech. We tend, European science and psychology has tended to explain speech as a kind of third-person process, as something that we stand outside of as an observer and watch it happen, and we're not engaged in it. And from that perspective, we tend to construe the events of speaking and the mechanism, you could say, of communication as a kind of linear causality existing in a mechanistic paradigm. When we treat language in that way, we treat it as a being among beings. And this is the problem Merleau-Ponty is identifying with our approach to language. We treat it as something that we can look at from the outside in the same way that we look at objects in the world. What we need to do instead is enter into the process of expression and live that process, enter into the speaking subject and do a phenomenology of the speaking subject in order to grasp the origin and the essence of language. And as we're going to see, and I think you can anticipate, the origin and the essence of language is expression, expressivity. So by doing a phenomenology of this expressive act, we begin to gain some access to that original principle that is behind all speech and all expressiveness. When we treat language as a being, as a kind of external thing that we look at, we tend to look at words as static unities, and we look at syntax as a kind of already completely outlined and clear set of rules by which speech makes sense, right? We start to think about it as something programmatic and something that is static and made up of kind of building blocks that we put together in order to arrange a sentence, right? We put together a few words and then a sentence comes about. In a similar way of understanding it, in the same paradigm, we'll think of the word as a stimuli and then the thought that it produces as a kind of representation, and the thought and the sound are two sides of the same reality, but what really bears meaning is our minds, our thought. And thought constructs meaning in this paradigm through a series of associations. And this is the paradigm that comes from Hume and from Kant, and it attempts to explain language externally as something that we're not a part of, but that we see going on in the world. This paradigm began to break down when linguists and psychologists started to think about language as a kind of activity, as something performative, something that we do, rather than being simply a transmission of information, right? Rather than it being a simple communication of my subjective, you know, state to your subjective state. Instead, language starts to be looked at as something that we do, and therefore words are a kind of instrument of our activity. And our activity, our intention, shifts oftentimes the context in which words are interpreted, and therefore that shows that one word does not have one value in terms of expression, because it can be used in very different contexts to a different purpose and with a different view in mind. And now Merleau-Ponty is still going to show us that this view of language as an instrument, of words as an instrument, is still not complete. It's still a faulty theory, and this theory still ends up falling back on this kind of ontic view of language as static entities, as an external third-person process. So Merleau-Ponty takes up these two historical positions. On the one hand, language is the disinterested denomination of something. You just stand outside of everything and say what something is, and each word has a single, unambiguous bestowal of meaning. So that's the first problematic way in history language has been looked at. And then the other one is language as an instrument. So words as an instrument. Now, both of these, explanations of language do describe something that goes on within our use of language. We do oftentimes use language as a kind of instrument, and we do oftentimes bestow a name to something in a kind of disinterested way. But that is not the fundamental use of language. That is not the origin of language. And theories have tended to use those phenomena as the basis for understanding language, when really they're kind of peripheral aspects of language and are certainly not phenomena that we should use as the defining characteristics of a theory of language. Merleau-Ponty kind of lays down the law, draws a line in the sand, and says that if we treat words as something external to us, as third-person processes, as things going on in the world that we observe as if a scientist, then words can no longer have a sense. And this word have is really important in this chapter from Merleau-Ponty. He opposes having to being. And when he makes this distinction, he uses the word being in a very particular sense in this context. When we think of something as a being, we mean specifically as something external to us that we treat as if from a third-person perspective. It's the kind of general object view of beings, right? And when he talks about having here, he means something deeply phenomenological and something that is connected to the idea of habit. And he points out this use of language as something ambiguous. We use the word habit and having. Those two words are etymologically connected, and we use these words in very ambiguous ways, but some of those ways that we use it are essential to the phenomenological view that Merleau-Ponty is creating here, and they shift the view of ontology away from beings into this realm of habit and having, which is something more close to gestalts, these holistic views of things. So, for instance, I could speak of having many habits, right? I have abilities and thoughts and memories and these kinds of things at my disposal. I bear them, I possess them, but they're not constantly actualized, right? When we think about a being, that being is like a totality. It's completely there. It's wholly finished and present, right? But when we think about things in relation to having and habit, Not everything is present at once. Not everything is realized in an instant. There are potentialities that something possesses and bears. So Merleau-Ponty is trying to get us to shift our attention towards that type of being, that type of ontology. Words are not entities that have everything present to us in an instant. No, they bear more potentiality. They possess and they have sense. And sense for Merleau-Ponty is not a finite meaning that can just be exhaustively explained in a sentence or something like that. Sense is something rich and kind of infinite and inexhaustible. So words for Merleau-Ponty bear or possess, they have a sense of their own. This means that they don't give us all of their meaning at once. They still have more potentiality in them. But also, this means that the words themselves have the meaning. We're not painting that meaning onto them. We're not projecting it onto them. Nor are we simply extracting it from them such that, in that extraction process, we take away everything from the word that it has to give us. We know its entire meaning, right? No, the word is still capable of being used in different contexts. The word itself, Merleau-Ponty is trying to show us, the sound and its use within our body schema, its place as a kind of gestural element within our expressivity, bears a sense that is irreducible to a kind of being that is fully understood and grasped in an instant. And this takes us to the heart of Merleau-Ponty's view on language. He wants to show us the way that language in our lived experience is a kind of organism of words. He has a kind of organic view of language. He's treating language, both the subjective intentionality going into the expressive act and the words that, we derive from our history, that we hear from other people, and the way those words evolve and take on new meaning in time. So he wants to see both of those aspects of language as organic processes, and he wants to see the act of expression as a kind of gestalt, as akin to not only coordinated behaviors. I mean, speaking is a coordinated behavior. I'm somewhat uncoordinated at times in my speech, but overall making something coordinated come about. And so not only is the activity something organic and something gestalt-like, but also the construction of the words themselves into phrases and into paragraphs, each one of those is kind of like an organism of its own. Merleau-Ponty is trying to open up a sort of integral view of language where different parts are doing different things, but they all sort of converge into a kind of organic, dynamic unity. And when we get back to language at that level, we find meaning coming to life, right? When we think about meaning in a dictionary, it is a sort of fossilized residue of a spiritual activity. It's a kind of sedimented and static view of meaning. Now, of course, words, when you look them up in the dictionary, oftentimes have multiple meanings. And we all know that people use words with double intentions, double entendres, and are able to use language in a way that's more complex than the kind of static view of language that a dictionary presents us with. Speech is much closer to the unity of a melody than it is to a kind of algorithm or an equation or something like that. It is a gestalt that, in the same way that a melody is heard immediately in the notes themselves, in the sounds that we hear, and yet it is not reducible to any of those notes. Like, if you break the melody apart, you've completely lost the sense of that melody. The same thing happens with speech. You cannot break a phrase into its component parts and have the sense of the phrase. The fragments, you could say, don't bear sense in the same way that the whole bears a sense. And this happens at every level, at multiple levels, within linguistic expression as well as within musical expression. The meaning of a phrase is present within the totality of the expression. It's something that has to be taken as a whole, or else you completely destroy and defile the sense that it bestows in its integral unity, in its holism. The meaning of a phrase, in short, is greater than the sum of its parts. It is itself a kind of emergent, dynamic process akin to those ideas we find today in complexity theory, like dissipative structures, autopoetic structures, and emergence. And while words can kind of be tools, and this is most obvious when you find a new word and you think, that really helps me express something, right? Then the word kind of appears as a tool, but it's more organic than a tool. It's more like how instruments become completely integrated into our body schema. We talked about this a few weeks ago with a blind person's cane, right? The cane becomes part of their living body. It becomes an extension of the body, but not even an extension. It's just directly part of the body. The same thing happens for a lot of musicians. The instrument becomes an extension of the expressive intentionality of the artist. The words become a central and integral part of our being in the world. And when we adopt a new word, once we find a new way of expressing ourselves, that transfigures the way we understand our world, and it transfigures the way other words can relate to each other, because they now have a new sort of node in that web of meaning that reconnects things, and it doesn't simply just make a new association. It changes the configuration of our words and of our expressivity as a whole, as a gestalt. Along with this idea of language as an organic unity, as a kind of organic theory of language, Merleau-Ponty is drawing out certain aspects of the gestalt character of language, right? And one of the really important aspects of that, if we remember back to things we talked about in Gestalt psychology, one of the biggest, most important ideas there is the idea of a background. And this idea of a background connects to the idea in Husserl of horizons, right? And the horizon, the background, these are all things that are quasi-present, right? And quasi-presence is a whole new way of understanding things that cannot be reduced to beings, cannot be reduced to third-person processes. We've talked about this a number of times already. And habit, having, these things involve a type of existence that does not reduce existence to the present or to presence to consciousness, right? And that's where we get temporality, the kind of being of the past, the kind of intentional being of the future and anticipations, which are part of intentionality. And it also gets at this idea of the quasi-presence. And this idea of quasi-presence is essential to the phenomenon of speech and the way of being in the world of a speaking subject. So Merleau-Ponty says that when we're speaking, we have a sense of what words we should say, but we're not immediately picturing in our mind the next word that we're going to say. And yet it's there to some degree. It's on the horizon. He says it's behind my back. It's as if right behind me, right? And that means that he calls it a near presence. It means that it's somehow salient. It's somehow approaching us. It's nearer to us than other words, right? And they become nearer and nearer to us without yet becoming completely present to consciousness. The words don't become present until we actually say them. And as we say them, their presence becomes manifest to us. But how could that presence have arisen into manifestation if it hadn't been on the periphery of our consciousness right before we said it, right? And so there's this weird twilight between night and day moment with words where our words are floating in a twilight, and they're not, for instance, purely in our unconscious. They're not in our pure memory, as he says, drawing on Bergson. They're not, in our unconscious, we technically have every word we've ever heard before, every word that we know the meaning to, and also some kind of organization among those words, which already structures those words for us. When we hear a certain word, a number of connotations open up, possible connections, and that sort of matrix and complex system of relationships is on the periphery of our consciousness. It's right at the edges of what we can perceive, And when I'm talking, what I need to say, that intention is opening up to a certain degree certain words as more salient, more important, more relevant, more expeditious in delivering the sense and the meaning that I intend. So the speaking subject is not simply, having already in mind a thought, I need to say this. An orator might have an entire speech memorized, but when you don't have a speech memorized, I didn't memorize or prepare a perfect script of what I'm about to say right now, but I have a intention and I have an orientation, and I know based on those, that attitude, that standpoint, that mood, what is going to be helpful, what words are going to be helpful, what words are going to be clarifying, what words are going to be extending and demonstrating the meaning that I am intending to convey. And when I'm in the act of speaking, it's very rare that I'm fully aware of this quasi-existence, this quasi-presence of the words. But if it wasn't the case, if it wasn't there, if they weren't in that quasi-present twilight space that they're in, half possibility, half already being actualized, right? They're in this space where they're almost there, but they're not yet actual. They're close at hand, but I haven't taken hold of them yet, right? If it wasn't for that, I would not be able to construct meaning on the fly. I would not be able to get in a speaking rhythm and throw together the right words at the right time and get to my destination of what I'm trying to convey. And along with this quasi-presence, the moment at which we seek to express something in language, we are at a lack, right? We are in a sort of state of deprivation. We have not realized, we have not fulfilled the intention. He calls this a kind of inchoate or nascent state. It's something burgeoning, something emerging. And in that gradual emergence of the thought, of the speech, of the kind of word organism, we're necessarily still in a kind of darkness, in a kind of ignorance, in a sort of lack. And I don't want to go too far in that direction because, on the other hand, and sort of in a paradoxical tension, oftentimes that inchoate and nascent moment of expression, we're overflowing with intentionality, with some deep grasp of the meaning that we want to express, and we are grasping for words desperately to let that overflowing sense, that overwhelming sense of something very determinate and profound that needs to be expressed. We're in that kind of giddy, curious state where we just need to articulate what we have to say. So I don't want to make it sound so negative and so we're at a lack and we're just striving to fulfill this lack. On the other hand, we're also overflowing and we need to make it finite, right? We're in something too infinite. The sense, the meaning is expansive, and we need to narrow it down. So both of those aspects are essential parts to the phenomenal experience of being a speaking subject. And the speaking subject is the one who engages in an attempt to express themselves and is in that inchoate state. While I'm speaking, I'm still reaching ahead. I'm still jumping ahead of myself, leaping ahead of myself in order to make sure I get to my destination, right? I'm orienting my trajectory, but I'm also seeing to it that every step of the way, what I've done has accomplished enough ground to get me to that destination. So the speaking subject is not in a state of certainty, because you can only be in a state of certainty with respect to the act of expression once you've completed that expression. You know, when you've written something down or told someone an idea and you think, wow, I really captured it and I really expressed it, that is a state of certainty and fulfillment and accomplishment and satisfaction, right? And that state comes about after the expression has been completed. So Merleau-Ponty is pointing us to the speaking subject as still in a process, still emerging, still forming the gestalt, still growing. So if speech is organic in the sense that, you know, the words themselves live on and have a life of their own, when I express something, that expression now lives on to have a kind of evolutionary and organic existence in the world beyond me. And that's another consideration altogether, and one that Merleau-Ponty is really trying to grasp hold of. But that refers to the organic reality of words. But on the other hand, we have the organic and burgeoning, nascent view of speech as a behavior, as an activity, as an expressive act that is unfolding and evolving within our subjectivity as speaking subjects, still in the process of expressing ourselves.